Hi, my name's Tom and welcome back to my channel and to my series Politics, in which we look at Netflix, politics and the point at which the two meet. If you want to check out the first two videos in this series in which I first introduce it and then take a look at Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, then I will link to those up in the top corner. And equally, if cultural analysis and or video essays are kind of your thing, then do consider subscribing. It would be great if you stuck around. Last week, a new season of BoJack Horseman hit Netflix, and as a huge fan of the series, I thought it would be worth taking a little look at. So without further ado, here we go. BoJack Horseman, created by Raphael Bob Waxberg, follows the adventures of BoJack F. Horseman and a wider ensemble of celebrities, publicists and hangers-on in Hollywood, or by Season 1 Episode 6, Hollywoo, Los Angeles. Previously the star of hit TV sitcom Horsin Around, which ran for 9 series from 1987 to 1996. At the opening of Season 1, BoJack is spending the vast majority of his time lounging around his luxury house in the Hollywoo Hills, drinking beer and watching DVDs of his younger self. Now, BoJack Horseman is incredibly thematically broad. While at its core it remains a critique of contemporary celebrity culture, it is also expanded out into political satire, commentary on contemporary discourses surrounding gender and sexuality, and very personal themes about the very nature of family, friendship and relationships. Now in its 5th season, BoJack Horseman has become something of a cult phenomenon, and I think what many people find particularly alluring about this particular show is that although it may ostensibly be a comedy, the messages that one often takes away from it are in fact incredibly serious. It's worth first off, however, talking a little bit about form. And now BoJack Horseman is far from the first TV series to take animation, a form that we usually associate with children's entertainment, as the medium for a series which is aimed at an adult audience. It's always really hard to talk about adult audiences without it sounding like adult audiences, but I just mean like grown-ups. Series such as Beavis and Butthead, the Adult Swim oeuvre, and South Park predate the recent glut of cartoons aimed at adults, including Big Mouth, BoJack Horseman, Archer, and similar. And the biggest difference between these more recent programs and shows such as South Park is that I think we've become far more accustomed as an audience to expecting animated content aimed at adults. In his book Taking South Park Seriously, for example, Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock argues that a key feature of early South Park was its awareness of itself as a differential signifier. That is, as a program whose meaning is dependent on the ways in which it compares to, and importantly, contrasts with, other animated programs. There is a very clear awareness in early South Park then that most of the audience would perceive something of an incongruence between the animated form of the series and the humour which is very much aimed at adults. For example, in the episode Simpsons Already Did It, there's a very clear engagement with what it is that differentiates South Park from The Simpsons, which has a much broader aimed audience.
This act, of course, reminded us all of the time that Bart Simpson took the head of the Springfield statue in one of their classic episodes.
Such an intertextuality, as it refers to kind of animated series, is almost entirely absent from BoJack Horseman, and today I'm largely going to look over the fact that this series is animated. And this doesn't mean that I don't think that that's important or interesting in any way, just that I think that the expectations of audiences has changed an awful lot since South Park first started airing. In regards to those more serious issues I mentioned a moment ago, BoJack Horseman has been widely celebrated for the manner in which it represents mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, and casual substance abuse. Now, the writers have certainly been unafraid to find humour in these. In early seasons, BoJack's blackouts, sometimes brought on by drink, sometimes by drugs, and simply sometimes by a kind of affective inertia, becomes something of a running gag. And interestingly, I think it is often because of this comedic engagement with such issues that the show is able to have such an astute portrayal of the complexities and difficulties of what it is like to experience such mental health conditions. In fact, Josh Pappenheim wrote a particularly provoking article for Shortlist, comparing the complexities of BoJack Horseman's engagements with issues such as mental health with the more simplistic, trope-based approach of 13 Reasons Why. If you're interested in this element of the show, then Wisecrack's video, The Philosophy of BoJack Horseman, is also worth checking out. However, I did find their kind of assumption that mental health conditions are only tied to having material fulfillment a little bit complicated, because being poor is pretty depressing too. That area of BoJack Horseman seems really well covered then, and so today I wanted to take a slightly different approach. Those of you who have watched other episodes in this series, and like, if not, why not? Please do, that would be really, really cool, and maybe you could like subscribe and stuff. Please. Those of you who have watched other entries to this series will know that my primary interest within it is looking at the way that shows on Netflix engage with contemporary society, culture and politics. And while there is much to be said about the contemporary mental health epidemic as a symptom of austerity, stagnant wages and rising inequality, today I wanted to take a slightly different approach by discussing an area of BoJack Horseman which I haven't seen discussed massively at all, but which is absolutely central to its plot. Back in the 90s, I was in a very famous TV show. See, central to the narrative of BoJack Horseman, particularly in early seasons, is the central character's relationship with the past. And this takes many forms. In Season 1, BoJack fixates upon his earlier success as the star of Horsin Around. In Season 2, filming starts on the movie Secretariat, which allows BoJack to escape into the life of his childhood hero, the racing horse Secretariat. Season 3 shifts back to BoJack's obsession with Horsin Around as he takes part in the production of an attempted spin-off show. And Season 4 revolves around BoJack's relationship with his mother, through which he relives both his own childhood and hers. I won't spoil Season 5 for those of you who have yet to watch it, but I hope you can see that throughout each season there is this recurring obsession with BoJack's relationship with his own past. Today I'm largely going to focus on BoJack Horseman's Invocation of the 1990s, because it's that which I think has the most repercussions, both for BoJack himself, but also for the show's discourses on contemporary society as a whole. The first season of BoJack Horseman is the most open in leveraging our nostalgia for the 1990s. However, as Alyssa Chatter has argued in an excellent article for the University of Western Ontario's undergraduate film journal, the series draws heavily on the stylistic choices of 1980s and 1990s TV sitcoms, particularly in the manner that the way the camera moves for BoJack Horseman very much imitates the 3-camera, fixed camera setup of those sitcoms. We can also see this influence in the exterior shots of characters' houses, which are used as establishing shots when we move from one location to another, which are very directly drawn from sitcoms such as The Brady Bunch, Full House, and The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Thus, for the most part, I think we can view BoJack Horseman as at least adjacent to series such as Stranger Things, which similarly draws its inspiration in both its aesthetic and its storytelling from films of the 1970s and 1980s, such as E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and It. A clear difference is that Stranger Things sets its own narrative within that period, whereas BoJack Horseman is set now, and thus in the former series it's only us the audience that are kind of glancing back through time with this air of nostalgia, whereas in BoJack Horseman we share that perspective with the protagonist. We'll come back to why that makes a real difference later. To remain for a moment on the invocation of nostalgia in film and television, I'd like to draw attention to a video by Lindsay Ellis released in December of last year, in which she looks at the role of nostalgia in both Stranger Things and the recent remake of the film It. Particularly, she argues that
the past as depicted in Stranger Things is a very 21st century kind of place. There is, for instance, little of the casual sexism or racism prevalent in Western society before 1990s political correctness kicked in.
Texts such as Stranger Things, then, draw upon the aesthetic and cultural references of an earlier period as little more than a filter. They take the cultural trappings of a period such as the 1980s, yet avoid engaging with the real complexities of that period. Such an act is referred to by the critic Frederick Jameson as pastiche. And Jameson defines his notion of pastiche primarily in relationship to parody. Parody being the act of taking the stylistic trappings or aesthetics of a former period in order to critique them. David Wayne and Michael Showalter's Wet Hot American Summer First Day of Camp, for example, draws upon the stylistic trappings of the teen sex comedies that were ubiquitous in the 1990s, such as the American Pie franchise. However, in doing so it ridicules various elements of those texts. The fact that the actors are all clearly much older than their characters' ages, for example, or the heavy reliance upon character archetypes and predictable narratives. Wet Hot American Summer then very clearly sits within Jameson's definition of a parody. Stranger Things, on the other hand, very rarely engages with the complexities either of the period in which it is set or the films and other cultural texts upon which it draws its inspiration. In Jameson's terms, then, it is, like parody, the imitation of a peculiar or unique idiosyncratic style, but it is the neutral practice of such mimicry, without any of parody's ulterior motives, amputated of the satiric impulse. Series such as Stranger Things then are not parody but pastiche. As I mentioned earlier though, BoJack Horseman differs in many ways to Stranger Things in its relationship with the past, primarily because where Stranger Things is actually set in the 1980s, BoJack Horseman is set in the present day. Our perspective and that of BoJack then is shared, and that allows the show to do two things. It can both critique the cultural output of the 1990s, but also directly comment on the way in which we view the past as a society. The opening episodes of BoJack Horseman indeed invite us to view the past, in particular the 1990s, through the eyes of BoJack in a manner which we might equally call pastiche. Certainly, this is tied into the fact that BoJack has failed to replicate the success of Horsin Around since the show's cancellation, and thus he clearly sees the period in a much fonder light than his somewhat aimless present. Yet the 1990s are also, initially at least, presented as an overwhelmingly more culturally wholesome period. We see this most clearly in the narrative of Sarah Lynn. Once a child actor in Horsin Around, Sarah Lynn is now seeking to reinvent herself as a pop star in a Miley Cyrus-esque trajectory. And there is a clear juxtaposition here between the quote-unquote wholesome family values of Horsin Around and the sexually charged aesthetic of Sarah Lynn's single, Prickly Muffin. A slightly different yet related comparison is made between BoJack's early career and that of the younger characters looking for success in the present day, where the then teetotal BoJack is depicted tirelessly honing his stand-up routine on the downtown comedy club circuit. In the present, we see characters being somewhat more cynical in their attempts at success. They throw ideas together quickly, not in search of artistic greatness, but simply fame. In this and numerous other ways, BoJack Horseman is incredibly cynical about contemporary celebrity culture, and early on it draws upon the 1990s as a sort of control variable in this discussion, a time when celebrity was earned rather than stumbled upon, and in which the cultural output, primarily television, was wholesome and moralistic rather than crass and attention-grabbing. Perhaps most troubling of all is the manner in which BoJack Horseman presents this contemporary culture as being all-consuming, subsuming even those who would seek to work against it. Characters whose intentions are incredibly genuine, such as Diane, for example, who clearly wants to write books and articles with deep artistic merit, yet she is quickly subsumed by this supposedly empty culture. First, when she is hired to ghostwrite tweets for Princess Carolyn's celebrity clients, and then when she becomes a content creator for the BuzzFeed-style website Girl Crush. Though it is tempting to view the difference between the 1990s and the present day within BoJack Horseman solely through the eyes of the protagonist then, I think we can largely see that it's not just through BoJack's fall from grace that the show makes a distinction between those two periods. Instead, it suggests that it is a vastly cultural difference between the wholesome, meritocratic, moralistic 1990s and a contemporary culture which is obsessed with narcissism. This distinction between the past and the present, however, is just the setup. And increasingly throughout the series, the show seeks to suggest that the wholesome veneer of the 1990s may have been just that, a veneer. One very obvious chain of events which shatters such a rose-tinted view of the past is that which takes place in Season 2, Episode 7, Hank After Dark. In this episode, Diane, while promoting her biography of BoJack, draws attention to accusations of sexual impropriety made against the much-loved TV show host Hank Hippopopoulos. Hank Hippopopoulos. Hank Hippopopoulos. Hank Hippopopoulos is accused of having sexually harassed numerous former assistants, and while these allegations are widely known about in Hollywood, they have, until this point, largely gone undiscussed. And as extra information, in a series of flashbacks, we see that Hank Hippopopoulos was a huge influence in the careers of both BoJack and Mr. Peanutbutter. And though he was well into his career by the 1990s, he was still a looming figure in that period, beating both BoJack and Mr. Peanutbutter to an Animal Choice Award. There are clear allusions here to the Me Too movement, and in particular the case of Bill Cosby, who, although there was allegations surrounding him for a long time, those only really came to prominence in 2014. And interestingly, the stand-up routine by Hannibal Buress, which really drew attention to these accusations in 2014, very directly approaches this notion of an antagonism between the wholesome, family values, non-swearing Bill Cosby that was often on screen and the reality of his actions offset. Furthermore, though BoJack Horseman retains a considerable skepticism towards the present, it is particularly interesting that social media and the ubiquity of the internet, elements of contemporary culture which are regularly depicted by the show as being a detriment to contemporary culture, make these revelations possible in a manner that would not have been possible in the 1990s itself. Though early on in the series, BoJack Horseman seems to be suggesting that an era of monolithic, unattainable celebrity was in some ways better than what we have now, as it continues, it increasingly problematizes this thesis. The show not only draws attention to the discontinuum between what was going on screen during the 1990s and some of the horrific things which were happening behind it, but it also seeks to suggest that it was perhaps because of this monolithic, centralized production of culture that this might have been made possible. Thus, we find our initial sanitized pastiche of the 1990s broken down and replaced with something far more complex and contradicting. Such an exploration of our relationship with the past only becomes more present in BoJack Horseman as the series continues. We can certainly see resonances of the show's problematicizing of the 1990s in the show's depiction of BoJack's obsession with his childhood hero, Secretariat. Growing up, BoJack viewed Secretariat as a role model, a stable and I can't get over the fact that it's stable and he's also a horse. A stable and successful figure who contrasted greatly with his abusive and sometimes unpredictable parents. Yet we increasingly learn that Secretariat, similarly to BoJack, struggled with depression and made some incredibly immoral choices, both factors in his eventual suicide. And, though in a very different way to Hank Hippopopoulos, we again find BoJack having to reconsider his admiration for Secretariat. He is forced to break down his formerly pastiched view of the past. The idol he once viewed as a charismatic, successful figure revealed to be no less human and troubled than the rest of us. Before closing, I wanted to briefly talk about the manner in which BoJack Horseman breaks down our kind of casual view of the past as being a separate place from the present. For though in its initial pastiched view of the 1990s, the show presents that period as a kind of different era, very much disconnected from the present, increasingly the show breaks down that dichotomy. This is particularly clear when, again in Season 4, Mr. Peanutbutter runs for Governor of California. In its bringing together of celebrity and representative politics, this is clearly an attempt to parody not just Arnold Schwarzenegger's time in that very office, but also Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. What it also does, however, is to bridge the gap between the monolithic celebrity culture of the 1990s and the social media-infused, fast-moving, attention-grabbing culture of the present day. Mr. Peanutbutter is very clearly a celebrity of that former period, yet he is very easily talked into adopting the supposed vapidity of contemporary culture, and this is perhaps a surprisingly easy pivot for him to make. For the manner in which Mr. Peanut Butter avoids making sincere policy promises shares a great deal with the projection of a vague wholesomeness that both he and BoJack represented in their sitcoms. And this is incredibly important, I think, for it reminds us that there hasn't been some kind of great shift in our culture, but that past has been incredibly formative in forging the cultural norms of the present day. Similarly to the manner in which BoJack comes to terms with his childhood, realising that for better or for worse it's made him the horseman that he is today, we're invited to view the 1990s not as a completely separate era, but to realise that the celebrity culture of that period had a great role in informing the supposed obsession with fame in contemporary society. So, to conclude, the manner in which we view the past is intrinsically political, not least because nostalgia is regularly mobilised to a political end. To draw on an extremely tired example, Donald Trump's presidential campaign succeeded not just by promising to make America great, but to make America great again. The Clinton campaign, however, equally drew heavily on nostalgia for the economic boom in the latter years of Hillary's husband's administration. In doing so, both campaigns drew upon a pastiched view of the past, sanitised, uncomplicated by issues of misogyny, racism, or a vastly inequitable economy. At the opening of BoJack Horseman, we are presented with a similar take on the 1990s, of a simpler time, a more wholesome era, in which culture was more predictable and stable. Stable again. Still horses. And yet the series regularly returns to that period, in order to remind us that to view that era in such a sanitised way is to indulge in pastiche. In many ways, remembering through that lens requires almost as much forgetting. And importantly, through Hank Hippopopoulos, through Mr. Peanut Butter, through BoJack himself, we're invited to see that it is not simply a case of being able to separate the good from the bad. In fact, in many ways, they're intertwined. That theme in particular is something which rises up again in the most recent season too. Yet in doing so, the show is not just inviting us to view the past as being more bad, but simply more complicated. And this is really important both in a political sense and in a personal one. For particularly when we see a BoJack in early episodes, we see this notion that the present, and particularly in relationship to BoJack's depression, is incredibly complicated, and he longs for the stability of the past. And so in reminding ourselves that the past was not stable, but was in fact incredibly complex and contested and complicated, it allows us to have a more thorough view of the present. And this notion of remembering that the past was equally as complicated as the present is important, both for ourselves and for our society. Thank you very much for watching this video. I've really been enjoying making these politics videos, and I think I'm kind of getting there, both with the style and the form of presenting, keeping it a little bit academic and theory-based, but also hopefully engaging in some way. If you have enjoyed, then please do consider subscribing if you haven't already, and if you have subscribed, maybe like the notification bell. Apparently that's important these days, and feel free to maybe tell a friend or something. But thank you very much for watching once again. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new video. For now though, have a great week.